Hey everybody, we are gonna take a look at the Pro Tools I/O setup window today. So we're gonna go through some typical ways of using the I/O setup. I'm right now booting up Pro Tools by holding down the N key in like November. When you start Pro Tools and hold down the N key the entire time before it actually launches, it brings up the Playback Engine dialog where you can actually choose your method of getting audio in and out of your system. So I'm going to start it with the default system I/O as if I did not have an interface hooked up. So right now I'm going to choose Pro Tools Aggregate I/O. Hardware buffer size, all this stuff is fine. We don't need the video engine for this, but it isn't going to make any difference to what we're doing here. So I'm just going to hit OK and allow for this to open up, and don't need to worry about any of that. But we want to go into Setup and into I/O here. Okay, so if we look at the tabs, we can start along the top here. For the Pro Tools Aggregate I/O, to actually pull information, it's going to pull it from your system setup. So in other words, from your audio MIDI setup, if you're running on a Mac, or whatever your ASTIO setup is if you're running on Windows. But what the system I/O is going to give you is you maybe have built-in speakers and you have a 3.5 millimeter line output for hooking up computer speakers. You probably have some kind of a line input, like a mic input maybe in your system, something like that. So these are going to be in here in the inputs and the outputs. And these are arbitrary. You can name them whatever you want. We can just call that speaker or something if we want to. You could change all these. It won't really make a difference. Then in the bus tab, okay, where you come into the bus tab, whatever I/O map you were using in, a previous session or in your current session that you're working on, all of those internal buses are all going to be over here named and set up, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything as far as the physical outputs or physical inputs are set up in your system itself, right? So the only thing right now that is actually mapped to the built-in speaker of my computer right now is the actual speaker output itself that I named over here. So if I wanted, say, whatever I had as my master output in the mix that was feeding a mix output in the session, I can just change that mix path to be the speaker. And the speaker, can be whatever, or we can just turn that off and not use that at all. Or if I didn't want it to play through the built-in speaker of the computer, which I probably don't, we can change that master output to hit the built-in line output. That's going to be the 3.5 millimeter jack in my computer itself that will then go and feed whatever I have hooked up. You can have a set of computer speakers hooked up, or you can run a 3.5 millimeter cable to a pair of RCA that maybe feeds a receiver and a big set of house speakers. I mean, whatever you can do to get sound from your Pro Tools session, you can decide all how that sound gets routed through here. So I'm going to just go ahead and OK all that because we're going to change it anyway. I want to go back into Setup, and we'll go into Playback Engine. And I'm going to change my Playback Engine back to my interface, which is the Digi 002 rack that has 8 inputs and 8 outputs, and gives me a little bit more flexibility, obviously, than the built-in computer audio. So if we go back in now and go into our IO setup, I can now see that my setup is already ready to go here. I've got 8 analog inputs. The first 4 have a mic pre. The last 4, 5 through 8 don't. They're just line inputs. So that's why these are mic or line 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and all my outputs are the same. Then we have, as well as the analog ins, we have an optical input. Okay, so then that gives us more channels digitally if we have an ADAT connection going on here for those guys. And then as well as a SPDIF digital, those are like the RCA type of connectors that use a digital signal. So that's 2 more channels that we can use there. So if, for example, let's say none of this was here, I'm going to select all that and delete it. And oh no. We can just create whatever we want here and name our paths whatever we want. So if I was to create, say, one stereo path, and I would call this something like out 1-2 and make sure to add the default channel assignments. Make sure that's checked. Once we create that, now out 1 and 2 is already lined up on 1 and 2 here. Okay, and let's make our subpaths of mono and add another one for out 2 and create that so that now each of these stereo paths that I'm going to create also has a out. Oh, let's rename that because we don't want out 1 or 2 1. We want out 1, out 2 to be mono and so on. And we can go through here and rename all that stuff. Or what we can do is just come down here and hit the default, which is usually a pretty good starting point because it's just going to automatically create all that for us. Now in the bus tab, same situation here where master did not exist in my IO setup, but it was a part of the session. So we can map that master out to my analog 1 and 2, which you can see by the little speaker icon here, is the path to my monitors through the IO. So now in my session, when I open it, the master will line up with analog 1 and 2 in my output settings, and that analog 1 and 2 is what actually hits the monitoring in here. So the bus tab is where you can create these buses and you can map and route them to whatever you want. I could even take, if I wanted, an internal bus like 7 and 8, I can route that internal bus to a physical analog output. So I could bus things internally in Pro Tools, and anything I send on that bus will now map to my analog outputs for 7 and 8. I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to, but the option is there. Okay, and last thing, the inserts. Okay, so just like any mixer system, Pro Tools, the mixer virtually in the system has insert points, and you can assign those to be whatever you wanted. So essentially, I have all of my channels set up to where they are optimally going to be capable of using inserts. I would never have 1 and 2 because those are going to be used to feed my monitors, so it wouldn't make sense to have an insert going on there. But if I was to take out 3 and out 4 and connect those to the input of physical hardware sitting here next to me and have the output of that console or that equipment feeding back into the in on 3 and 4, then I can use a hardware insert in my Pro Tools session and have hardware control and have the audio passing through physical analog gear here, as well as, and this is the important thing, the delay compensation being accounted for the A to D and D to A conversion that has to happen within that Pro Tools session. So since I'm only using analog 1 and 2 as my path to the monitors, that means I have 6 other channels that I can have compressors or EQs or some sort of harmonic saturation or whatever I want to have my mix coming out of the Pro Tools mixer through my analog hardware and back into my system through my interface with delay compensation done by Pro Tools. So other than that, you guys might just stick with default stuff. You might get kind of creative, see what kind of abilities you have as far as optical. You're going to need something that can have a Toslink like light pipe cable connection between it in order to get in and out of that extra gear or whatever. But you could even use that as an insert. SPDIF, you could be used as an insert if you have something like an Axe Effects or a guitar cab modeler that uses a digital SPDIF connection. So experiment, play with it, see what you can do, and have fun. All right.